You know, it's crazy that it's Halloween and it's the spooky season, and yet no one is talking about this particular story. So back in 7th grade, we read a lot of interesting stuff, especially one story that still stuck with me to this very day. And let me remind you guys, I am a grown 30-year-old man. So when I say that to this day, this story still shook me to my core, there's a good reason for that. And the story in question is Three Skeleton Key, which was written by George G. Tudose. And even though it was said that he wrote a lot of short stories and novels during his years as a writer, Three Skeleton Keys still remains as one of his most popular stories, if not his only popular story. But it's just crazy to me that nobody is talking about this. Hell, even Vincent Price did a radio show on this back in the 40s. And you know what? I feel that this has fallen upon me as a fellow storyteller to tell you guys this chilling tale. And since this is the month of spooky ghosts and goblins and ghouls and all that, I figured this is the perfect time to tell you guys this story. And trigger warning, if you can't see behind me, this story has rats. You've been warned. Our story takes place in a lighthouse off the coast of the French Guiana, where the lighthouse has been looked after by 3 keepers. Because I can't remember the characters' names, I'm just going to go ahead and give them new ones. The first one is Bobby, who is the narrator of the story. The second one is the chief, who is the oldest of the 3. And the third one is called Skinny the Hooch. Why is he called the Hooch? Because you're going to have to give him a drink to shut him up. Anyway, the men have been living in the lighthouse and they've been enjoying their time there. It wasn't really nothing to do but to keep the lighthouse going. They would play cards, clean up their rooms, reminisce about their time at sea. It was a good time. Until one day at 2 o'clock in the morning, the chief, who was still keeping a lookout for ships at sea, winds up waking up the other 2. And in the distance, there was a 3-mast ship out in the open. Her sails were going, and since it was a really strong wind, it was pretty much pulling the ship closer to the island till it stops, and then it pushes her in a completely different direction. The 3 men were confused, and they were wondering what is up with the crew. Shouldn't they be moving their ship away from the island, especially with the lighthouse going and warning them that there are sharp rocks? And the chief had the bright idea that maybe it was because of the fact that they abandoned the ship, leaving her derelict in the water. But the strangest thing is that the ship still had her lifeboats, so therefore, if she still had their lifeboats, what happens to the crew? And for hours, they've been watching the ship, seeing if she was going to crash into the rocks or if she was just going to sail on over the horizon and they'll never see her again. And at this point, all 3 of them were keeping watch on the ship, trying to figure out what was going on until something happened. The chief made a grim discovery and he decided to give the binoculars over to Bob. Bob then takes the binoculars and he looked, and what he saw made him shiver. Not only is it confirmed that the ship still had her lifeboats, but there was a black and brown mass on the ship that was going to and fro, moving on the top poop deck like it was the ocean. But after closer examination, it wasn't just any mass. These were rats. And it didn't take long for the 3 men to put 2 and 2 together. The ship's crew didn't abandon ship. They were overtaken, killed, and eaten by the rats. Because these aren't normal rats so that you would see whenever you would go into the kitchen and they pretty much would scurry across the floor trying to find food. These were sea rats. They were a lot bigger, a lot fiercer, and a lot smarter than their land counterparts. And they are very vengeful creatures. If you attack one of them, you're going to be swarmed by a whole bunch of them, and they will not stop until your flesh is stripped from the bone. Once there was a Dutch captain that had 2 dogs that he sent in order to take care of the rat problem just so they won't ruin the cargo. 24 hours later, they never saw those dogs again. You can already guess what happened to them. And these particular rats on that ship are even worse than regular sea rats. Because from the look of the ship, it has been out to sea for a very long time, which means these rats are way more hungry and way more vicious. So when the men realized how much danger they were in, they were hoping and praying that the ship would literally sail on, but unfortunately, she didn't. Not only did she crash in the rocks and split in 2 and went down to the bottom of the ocean, but the rats were swimming their way to the island. And once they got to that island, they took one sniff of the air and realized that the keepers were in the lighthouse. Knowing how dangerous their situation was in, they barred the doors and the windows to make sure the rats would never get in. But their nightmare was just beginning. These rats winded up swarming up the tower of the lighthouse, filling the viewport of every single window. And their smell was so intoxicating that it became harder for the 3 men to breathe. There were so many rats that they winded up blocking out the view of the sun to where the only thing that the men were their red, beady little eyes staring down at them, scratching at the glass, trying to claw their way inside, unaware that there's a thick layer of glass that keeps them away from their prey. And the 3 lighthouse keepers knew their situation. They were either going to starve to death in the lighthouse, or the rats will find their way inside and they'll be fed. So for 6 days and 7 nights, the three men have been stuck in that lighthouse at the mercy of the rats. Bob was slowly going insane and he was trying to count how many number of rats, and he would literally lose count after like 30. Old Chief was sitting there stoic as always, trying to wait for help to arrive. And Skinny, he got it the worst. Because of how bad their predicament is and knowing they have a slim chance of survival, Skinny was the first one to crack. He started singing, dancing, and raving like a madman, and it was safe to say it was just not helping the situation at all. And to make matters worse, on the 7th night, the rats suddenly found a way inside. When Old Chief was asleep in his bed, the rats chewed their way through a wooden window frame in his room. And even after he woke up and called for help, it was already too late. The rats were slowly coming in swarm and they were on him. Bob rushed to the Chief's aid and they both started fighting off the rats. But the Chief was severely injured by the bites and slashes that he got from the rats, and more were starting to pour in. So Bob got the Chief to his feet and they both ran like hell, making their way up to the lighthouse and closing the wooden trap door. They thought they were safe for a while until they started hearing scratching and chewing, and the rats were chewing their way through the door. So they decided to go up higher and go into the lighthouse room, where they closed a metal trap door. And even though that all three of the men were safe in that room, they weren't going to survive all that long. Especially now that the rats have broken into the lighthouse and are eating all the food supply that they had. And sitting at the top of the lighthouse, there's no guarantee for escape. And so for another couple of nights, their situation gets worse. Skinny was already far gone as he was ranting and raving like a madman. And the Chief suddenly caught fever because of the rat attack. All while the rats were outside, waiting, listening, watching them. Those beady little eyes, those hungry scowls, just looking down on their prey. But luckily, the three men heard a tugboat off into the distance, and that was when Bob had an idea. If he could somehow use the lighthouse to send a signal to the tugboat, there might be a chance that him and his pals might get off that island alive. So with a flash from the lighthouse, thus blinding and scaring the rats who were outside on the surface, he sends a signal to the tugboat telling them the situation, to which they signal back saying, "Don't worry, help is on the way." The tugboat then returned to civilization, only to come back hours later with a barge filled with meat. And after smelling that meat, the rats winded up making their way to the barge. And like I said, these are sea rats, so they can swim. So they made their way to the barge and dined on the delicious meat that was there. And while the rats are enjoying their meat, the tugboat, at a safe distance, decided to splash the rats with gasoline. And with incendiary cells available, they fire at the barge and set fire to the rats. And the available rats tried to make their escape into the sea, but winded up being lunch for the sharks. And after taking care of their pest problem, the tugboat makes their way to the island in order to rescue the three men. And after that ordeal, we then learn what happened to the three men. For one, Skinny has gone so insane after his ordeal, they carted him away to an asylum. And Old Chief, after he suffered from his wounds from the rat attack, he died from infection. And as for Bob, for some reason, he decided to go back and work at the lighthouse, which you would think after that ordeal, he probably would stay away from any and all lighthouses, but I mean, whatever. But yeah, that was the story of Three Skeleton Key. I consider it a Halloween tradition to go back and re-listen to the story again. And sure, the story may not be scary to say, but it will still make it a very interesting, scary story in order to tell the kid. I highly recommend checking out the radio show version by Vincent Price, because not only was Price a damn good narrator for that story, but he also knows how to heighten up the fear factor. But anyway, what do you guys think about this story? Have you heard the tale of Three Skeleton Key? Or for that matter, what's your favorite scary story? Leave it down in the comments below, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.